Hello everyone, welcome back to another remote sensing lecture video. And in this lecture video, I want to wrap up with our final thoughts on unsupervised classification. And this is sort of some tips and some tricks and some sort of pros and cons to unsupervised classification. So the number one thing that I want to sort of mention here is it's always better to start with more classes and merge down. Right, if you watched the example video all the way through, you'll notice that I ended up with, I think, 4 classes. I had hoped to get 6, but I ended up with, maybe I ended up with 5. But I had run the clustering algorithm telling it to give me 12. So it's always better to start with more classes than you think you need, and then interpret them down after the fact. 2. Don't be afraid to rerun your classification with more classes. Right, if you get to a point where you really think you should be able to discern between 2 surface features, right? You don't think it's an issue of spectral or spatial resolution. Don't be afraid to bump up the number of classes and see if maybe the next iteration with an additional class or 2 might pull those apart. And then you can again merge down to get where you need to be. Now, the next ones are going to be some cons, some things that we didn't really talk too much about, but there are a couple of cons. 3, right? It can be difficult to know/interpret unsupervised classifications. Right, this is really an art form, and it takes not just a lot of remote sensing practice and remote sensing understanding, especially in terms of imagery selection and being able to say whether or not you feel comfortable that these surface features that you really think you should be getting, you're actually able to, but also just a fair amount of understanding of what's going on the ground. It's in some cases it's really expert knowledge, looking at an image and saying, yeah, I know what that is, I've been there before. So it can be really difficult to know and interpret unsupervised classification, and it can also just be difficult to figure out how many classes to start with. Right, it's generally a good practice to start with more than you need, but how many more? Again, in the example that I did in the live example, right, I started with 12. And for the sake of time, I didn't go back through it and run it multiple times, but maybe I would have had better luck with some of the discrimination if I'd have gone up to, say, 15 classes, right? It really is sort of trial and error in some cases. And then the 4th one, and this one is it's not so much an issue of repeatability as it is just the fact that there is a degree of randomness. Right? If you remember back to our discussion on k-means when we sort of the conceptual walkthrough, right? The first step was generate random cluster centers. And so, you can imagine that if you ran, in ArcGIS Pro, it's isocluster, which is a different algorithm, but it does essentially the same thing under the hood, right? Where you can imagine if you run it once with one set of random cluster centers, and then you run it again with a different set of random cluster centers, right? Your results might change. And depending on the nature of your data set and the things that you're interested in trying to pull apart, right? It can vary quite a bit. And so there is this degree of randomness. And again, that's not to be confused with repeatability, right? We have ways of making the computer give us the same answer multiple times. But again, it is still a random answer, right? Because you could change your what's called the random seed, right, and get a different output. Even if we get that same output again and again and again and again, right, it's still based inherently on this random nature. So there is just a degree of randomness that might impact the results. So hopefully this all makes sense. Hopefully this sort of wraps up this idea of unsupervised classification. And as always, please reach out. Thank you.